Nearly 22,000 are dead in Gaza since the war broke out following a Hamas invasion of Israel October 7th. This calculation includes civilians and combatants and is reported by the Hamas-led Health Ministry in Gaza. While the war remains contained in the Middle East, its impacts can be closer to home. WGLT's Melissa Ellen explores how trauma plays out even in Bloomington-Normal.
Meryl Brown lives in Bloomington-Normal. She's Jewish and has visited Israel in the past, but that's her only connection to the land. Still, she says she's deeply impacted by what's happening there.
I haven't been there in many, many, many years. And yet when you go, it feels like home. And home is hurting.
Brown is referring to the Israel-Hamas war, which started October 7th. The Palestinian-led militant group Hamas invaded Israel, killing around 1,200 people and taking roughly 240 Israeli hostages. Israel declared war in response, and the death toll keeps rising. More than 85% of Palestinians in Gaza are also displaced. While the war is contained to the Middle East, people like Meryl Brown are being impacted even in Bloomington-Normal. There have been protests nationwide calling for a ceasefire, including one in Uptown 2 months ago. Suspected hate crimes are also on the rise. Meanwhile, graphic images and stories of the war are being shared digitally across news outlets and social media, all of which can take its toll on people's mental health. It may even cause trauma. That's according to Keith Brotheridge, a training coordinator at the Normal-based nonprofit The Baby Fold. He explains how it works.
I can only infer that if you're going down into social media, news media outlets, you're viewing horrific images, you're reading horrific stories, that's going to potentially put someone at risk for literally developing post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, which we call secondary traumatic stress.
In other words, viewing or reading material about others' trauma can start to cause trauma. Tama Bryant directs the Culture and Trauma Research Laboratory housed in Pepperdine University. She says this type of secondhand trauma can display in a variety of ways, from nightmares, hypervigilance, and intrusive thoughts to serious mental health conditions.
It can also show up with depression. It can show up with anxiety, increased anxiety. Some people may be feeling grief and mourning, even if they didn't know the specific people personally.
This isn't the first war to have such an effect on the American people. Just a few years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a similar U.S. response. And even prior to social media, Keith Brotheridge at The Baby Fold says research shows secondary trauma is real. He points to 9/11's lasting effects on mental health professionals who developed symptoms as a result of listening to their clients discuss that day. Not to mention the intergenerational trauma associated with Israelis and Palestinians who have lived with conflict for decades. Brotheridge says it can dredge up trauma for Jews and Palestinians alike. Tama Bryant at the Trauma Research Lab says she's already heard from people experiencing secondary traumatic stress from the Israel-Hamas war. More locally, Brotheridge says he hasn't heard much about this being an issue, but people like Meryl Brown of Bloomington-Normal can't keep their minds off of it. She says her life is going well here, so it's confusing. Brown says she also feels like the war isn't a topic of conversation in the area. Her Jewish congregation at Moses Montefiore Temple in Bloomington will talk about it, and a neighbor reached out after October 7th, but she hasn't heard much else. Even on this, Brown is conflicted. While Brown says she laments the lack of conversation, she adds that she's not sure she's even capable of talking about it. Right now, she mostly discusses with her therapist.
Even me, I don't know what I need, right?
Bryant at the Culture and Trauma Research Lab says behavior like this is also common. Another symptom of secondary trauma can be avoidance. Bryant says people may tune out of the news and social media entirely to keep themselves protected. For Bloomington-Normal resident Omar Kokar, it's a little harder to ignore. He knows Israelis and Palestinians who are living the trauma of this war firsthand. He's reaching out to them, and he's keeping himself informed.
I can't imagine the abject terror that they must have felt that day, along with the constant fear of attack. To live under that kind of mental stress is mind-boggling to me.
Kokar says depictions of children in Gaza linger with him. He says he's affected viscerally.
My mind can't even get to some of those stories. It short circuits, and I hug my kids tighter.
Kokar says some of the community events have lifted his spirits. He mentioned a mid-November vigil for peace hosted by Bloomington-Normal Not in Our Town. Rabbi Rebecca Dubow at the Moses Montefiore Temple in Bloomington helped organize this vigil. She says other faith-based organizations in the area assisted. She says these interfaith and community relationships have helped the congregation in its resilience.
I truly believe that because of that, we don't feel that alone.
Similar to Kokar, Dubow has a personal connection to the conflict. She has family and friends in Israel, and she says her heart goes out to everyone affected. Because of her role at the temple, Dubow says she's uniquely positioned to help others. She checks in on congregants and is in touch with local college students, making sure they're supported. She's heard from community members fearful of displaying their Judaism publicly since the war.
I recognize that my role is to be of a comforter and just to be present.
Trauma Lab Director Tama Bryant recommends that people rely on each other and reach out, as Rabbi Dubow has. She also encourages those who need it to seek professional help. She says that's the best way to get through this time. I'm Melissa Ellen.
Israel on Monday said it was removing thousands of troops from Gaza. Israeli officials have since clarified this does not mean the war is ending. Melissa Ellen covers mental health for WGLT as a Report for America Corps member. Report for America places journalists in local newsrooms across the nation to cover underreported topics.
Support for WGLT mental health coverage comes from Report for America and Chestnut Health Systems, caring for the community's physical and mental health and celebrating 50 years of service.